try these over the week, try these different types of ice creams and tell me which one you like. It was given as a task to some of these people. So the reason I put this case vignette is I will discuss her in terms of the different kinds of therapies when we were doing, what helped, what did not help with her as we go in. But also here you can see that most of the diagnostic criteria that I was talking about in terms of borderline personality is clearly manifest in this case vignette and this person, Tara. Okay, now moving on. DBT was developed by Marsha Linehan in the 1990s, and she chiefly developed this mode of therapy for people with suicidal self-injurious behaviors and borderline personality disorder. Now, self-injurious behaviors does not only mean cutting, it means hitting themselves, pinching, they could be hair pulling. There's a lot of self-injurious behaviors that a person can engage in, and especially in borderline personality disorder. Now, Marsha Linehan herself was a person who had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And if you look at her history, she did not get the help she was looking for. She was diagnosed with a variety of things, including some sort of psychosis at a point. And she felt that all the therapies, whether it was psychodynamic or analytical therapy, as well as CBT, which was there at that point, did not help her get what she wanted. And it is out of that need that she developed dialectical behavior therapy. Though it was developed for self-injury and borderline personality disorder, it is also found to be effective later on with eating disorders, substance abuse, and several other conditions where emotion regulation was a core difficulty. It also uses cognitive behavioral interventions because these are very evidence-based and these have been incorporated into DBT. Now, before we move on to the DBT and what are the different sections of DBT, I would like to tell you about the biosocial theory of BPD. This was the theory that Linehan came up with somewhere in 1993. She tried to explain how BPD developed in an individual. And what she was talking about was there is emotional regulation dysfunction along with an invalidating environment, which then leads to development of emotional vulnerability in the individual, which in other words means affective instability. Now, emotional dysregulation is a person who does not know how to identify, feels excessive emotions, intense emotions, gets overwhelmed by them, has inappropriate means of expression. That coupled with an invalidating environment, and I will discuss invalidating environment a little bit more in detail in a while. So both of this together makes the person highly vulnerable in terms of they're unable to manage, and this vulnerability manifests in behavioral aspects. This would be in terms of risk-taking behavior, in terms of self-harm, behavioral instabilities. In interpersonal relationships, there's a lot of breakups, high intense relationships where they might have several relationships, they have difficulty sustaining a relationship. They often break it off when at different points and then feel a sense of rejection, feel abandoned by the other person. And self, which I was talking about, is the fragile sense of self, the identity, the self-image are all very fragile. Cognitively, attention, concentration, they have ruminations, and they'll have depressive thoughts. A lot of this comes up in all this manner. Whenever I say interpersonal, please understand that I'm not referring only to a romantic relationship. I'm referring to every sort of interpersonal relationship, including parents, including friends, colleagues, any sort of relationship. And I don't specifically mean only romantic relationships. So what we mean by emotional vulnerability is that the person is emotionally sensitive. Sensitive is they're easily triggered. Small things, anything can be a trigger and can get them to respond emotionally to it. The second part of it is that there's reactivity. They are highly reactive. So not only are they easily triggered, but they also experience intense emotions. Now, intense emotions are not restricted only to anger and sadness, but even to happiness. If you've noticed, some of these people with borderline especially would tend to respond to even small things with a lot of happiness and joy. And that plays a part into, like, for example, let me tell you, in case of Tara, she was also admitted in the hospital, and as per hospital protocol, I used to see her 3 times in a week. I mean, I didn't have daily sessions because we needed a day to process information, but we had sessions every alternate day. So I would still be going to the ward to see other patients, but not her on a gap day. And when she saw me and I just said a hi, you can see how happy she felt during that period. She had become quite attached to me in the process of therapy, but she would be extremely happy. And she said, you know what, I was so happy I saw you. I could show you something, though it was not therapy related. And just seeing and smiling and saying a hi is enough for her to feel extremely happy. So I meant even happiness is an emotion that they would feel intensely. Of course, anger and sadness will result in more problematic behaviors when it's intense. But I'm saying every emotion is felt like that. They can have intense jealousy. If you talk to some of them, you find that in their romantic relationships, they might be intensely jealous of their partner. Who are they talking to? Why are you talking to that person? Why are you not talking to me? All of that comes in there. In addition to these two, the problem becomes in terms of their slow return to baseline, which means they take a lot of time to come back. Once they have been aroused, once they have been activated, once they start feeling upset, or once they start, any of that happens, it takes a longer while for them to calm down and to feel neutral. They continuously feel upset for a longer period. We talk about invalidation or an invalidating environment. Now, when I'm saying this, I do not mean to blame, and I would also suggest that all of us remember that we're not blaming the parents for anything that happens here, right? Even when the parents are being good enough parents, sometimes the fit is not okay. There's an emotional fit that we're talking about. So these people with borderline, who develop borderline as a child, are highly emotionally vulnerable. We just discussed about how sensitive and reactive they are, and they feel so intensely. So a family who does not understand the need of the child and treats the child like any other child, says, okay, you will understand how to deal with your emotions, you will figure it out. A lot of children grow up looking at parents and say, okay, when my father felt angry, this is what he did, or this is how my mother responded to sadness. Okay, so these seem to not express it in a particular way. I understand this. So they'll watch and learn. You model what you see around home, outside. But when a child has such intense needs, they don't know their emotions, they feel overwhelmed by it all the time, they need extra attention, extra care, which for whatever reasons, whether they were working, whether they were, for whatever reasons, the parents were not able to notice and fill the gap for the child. That is when an emotional fit is not there. What happens is sometimes also there are reciprocal effects. And by reciprocal effects, I mean that when the child is unable to manage emotions, for example, the child is not able to handle anger, so throws a tantrum, breaks things around at home. So parents respond to that with more force, saying, okay, more restrictions, you don't get things. How can you get angry like that? So they try to control the behavior of the child by being more controlling. However, why the child got angry is not something that is looked into. Now, what is making you angry? Why are you having this outburst is not something that they look into. And hence, it can cause the child either to deny or suppress emotions. I'm not supposed to be feeling these emotions. I'm not supposed to express. If I express my emotions, people get all aggressive at me. They get angry with me. They stop me from doing things. So I should not express things. Emotions are bad. They start feeling that. And that becomes an invalidating environment. A lot of people, unintentionally, parents would have said, oh, it's not a big deal. You should forget about it. Just snap out of it as the child is going about it. Or don't cry. Girls don't get angry. Or boys don't cry, are common statements that are made which affects these children who are highly vulnerable in a very different manner. A person who's not that vulnerable may not have the same response to this. But however, in this case, it is different. Now, absence of a parent, any sort of abuse, be it physical, be it sexual, be it emotional abuse, can have impact of invalidation, similar with emotional neglect in the child. Now, moving on to one of the main philosophies of DBT. Like I said, DBT has it's a part has a bit of acceptance and change. So basically, you're talking about a Buddhist tradition and you have CBT tradition. The main dialectic is acceptance versus change. Now, what do I mean by dialectic? A dialectic is something that is an opposing thing. It can be both true and, if you accept one, the other one, what happens? The opposing forces is what we're trying to say. Now, what it tries to do is integrate this. We're talking about acceptance of the patient's acceptance of themselves, as in, okay, I have these issues. I have a problem with emotion regulation. I have impulsivity as a part of what I am. This is who I am. Okay, I have a lot of difficulties in life. That's acceptance. But does that mean that that's it and I leave it? No. The point is to make that, but I can also be different. I can also improve my life state. I don't, just because I feel upset most of the time, I don't have to stay upset. I tend to get upset and I can change that. So acceptance and change. And the point is, if you do not accept, you're not going to be able to change. It's the chief philosophy in dialectical behavior therapy. So like I said, the acceptance part comes from the Buddhist tradition that everything in life is a part of life. All that happens is a part of life. And the change comes from CBT, where we say that if things are not working, they can be changed. And that's the basic principle in DBT, which is followed. So accordingly, we have acceptance and validation strategies, and then we have change-oriented strategies. Now, when I talk about acceptance and validation, one of the core aspects or one of the things that you have to remember as a skill in DBT is validation. And especially in individual therapy, validation is something that you have to start from the very first session. What does validation mean? Validation is when you communicate that you understand the emotion or the motivation behind a behavior. What I mean by this is when you say that, suppose the client comes to you and so let's take some problematic behavior like self-harm itself, that someone comes in with in the session. So let me tell you about Tara. Now, while she was admitted in the hospital, as a part protocol and everything, initially we drew up non-suicide contract, a behavioral contract, that she will not engage in self-harm. She will not try to kill herself during the process. She will participate. We drew up a behavioral contract. She agreed to it. Everything went fine. But into the second week of admission, she actually ended up cutting herself. Now, I know that the first response that I had in my head at that point was, we just agreed not to cut. Why did you do it? Was the thing I thought about. However, if I had used that as a strategy when I was talking to her, we wouldn't have gone any further. My response to her would be no different from the response she's been receiving from her parents, people around her, from her other past experiences. But am I saying that self-harm is correct? That it's okay for her to be self-harming? It is not. But what I talked about was not whether the self-harm was right, wrong, good, bad. What I asked her and spoke to her was, what was happening that you had to cut yourself? What was going on in the day? And, it took a little bit of exploration, but she spoke about how she was feeling overwhelmed. She had had an argument with her mother or with her father, I'm not very sure, I remember, but one of those with her parents. And that had made her feel so horrible. She wanted to end her life. And she's like, nothing was making sense. There were a lot of emotions. I didn't know what I was doing, and I cut myself. I felt like I just needed to stop all of this. So what I validated there was that, yes, if you were feeling so overwhelmed, if you were feeling so upset, I can understand why you may have the need to cut yourself. I didn't agree that it was the right behavior to do, but I understood that she had been feeling horrible. It was like the world was crashing around her and she could do nothing. She was trying desperately to take control and stop the thoughts. Pain was a way in which she was going to do that. Right? And that I understood. I validated that emotion. I validated the motivation for that action. I did not. Once I do this, then I could move on to the next step with her, which said, I understand that when this happens, you're overwhelmed, you hurt yourself. Now, is there some other way in which you could have coped with it, which may not involve cutting yourself? This conversation was possible only because I validated that. Now, one of the things that these clients really miss in their life is the sense of validation. They've not had it before. They've been told you're wrong, what you're doing is disruptive, you are manipulative. No one asked them why you're doing it. What was behind this, right? And that is what we do as therapists in working with these clients, including telling them that, yes, you've had a very bad childhood. Your parents did not, while not blaming the parents, but say it was, difficult for you to have a mother who always criticized you, a mother who kept telling you that nothing you did was ever enough. And when you looked as a child to look at somebody else to help you out of it, there was nobody else in the family to help you. You could feel extremely lonely. Now here, I'm not blaming them, but trying to explain how she as a child might have felt. I validate her emotions. And that is very crucial in working with borderline and in DBT. Now, the second part of this is the acceptance-oriented strategies. Now, acceptance-oriented is now when you, after you validate they're open to conversation, you kind of start telling them that, listen, there are difficulties. You help them become aware of it. What are the emotions that you're feeling? How are things happening around you? What is it that your problems are? You start acceptance. Now, radical acceptance is, this is how things are. Sorry, is there something that I need to? Okay. So radical, and then tolerating distress and being mindful of current emotional other experience, just to be aware of what's happening with you, what are the different emotions that are going on, is acceptance-oriented strategies. Of course, the change-oriented strategies are very simple, where we start talking to them about solving a problem, identifying it, changing their thoughts, changing the environment, and the kind of reinforcement they get at the end of it. Now, what are the functions of therapy? We aim to enhance the client's capabilities, which means we first identify that they have capacity to do things. They're not, it's not like they have nothing. They have a lot to start with. They have been dealing with their emotions longer than you have seen them. They've been trying to deal with it themselves. So that means if they've been able to hold up till now with all the distress they've had, they definitely have some amount of skills that's holding them up, right? So you enhance the ability that they have. You generalize what you've been taught. What is happening in the session needs to be generalized to different aspects of their life, whether it's in relationships, whether it's in their work with self, but you help them generalize it to real life scenarios. So you do a lot of role plays with them. You get them to act on it. This is all part of your, change-oriented strategies. You improve motivation, reduce dysfunctional behavior. You also structure environment. Now, structure is something that these clients really benefit from. And by structure, I don't mean a rigid structure, but some amount of structure is very highly supportive. So for example, when you're seeing a client with borderline, you kind of tell them that, you know what, every week on Wednesday, I will see you at 12 o'clock. We'll have a 1-hour session, and then we'll discuss the next week, we will do the same thing. We will meet in this room and in this place. So these are very physical things that you're giving them, which gives them consistency. You will always meet at that time. This is what I'm going to be there. So the thing that you're trying to do is be consistent with them. So you need to structure the environment a little bit for them, right? Structuring environment also includes, if you find that the patterns of interaction are highly problematic with the family members, then your response is also to take them and, kind of refer the family for family therapy. Enhance and maintain therapist capabilities. This is what I was talking about initially, that DBT emphasizes that the therapist who is seeing the client needs support, needs motivation, because these clients, the achievement, the time when you achieve goals with these clients are slightly longer than when you deal with the other people. And by slightly longer, I'm actually understating it. It takes a long while to achieve the goals that you want to work with them. It's a slow progress, but you notice small changes, micro gains. Just because on 1 week you tell them, let's not self-harm, I will teach you some techniques, it's not like they're going to stop it by the next week and you're done with it. It'll take you sometimes 2 to 3 months. Now, throughout the time that Tara was in the hospital, I had to work with her repeatedly on self-harm. And it was only in the 3rd month that she stopped completely. But the first 2 months with 3 sessions a week, so that's about 12 sessions a month, she had not completely stopped self-harming. It took me another 12 sessions for her to actually be all right with stopping it completely. So imagine, I'm seeing her for 24 sessions and the target behavior is not resolved. As a therapist, I was losing motivation. And so you need a team. You need a supervisor. You need a consultation team who helps you with details. You have a psychiatrist in the team. Okay. So DBT usually has these components that it's a comprehensive treatment. So not only does the person have an individual therapist, I mean, it happens abroad. I have not seen much of this happening in India, of course, but abroad you have an individual therapist who will do all this work. Simultaneously, while they're in individual therapy, they also attend a group where they gain skills. All your mindfulness skills, distress tolerance skills are all taught in a group setting. And in between sessions, there's a phone consultation. If they want to use it for 15-20 minutes, you call up, you discuss a crisis, and it gets done. And the other component of DBT is having a therapist consultation team, where you have the group therapist, the individual therapist, the psychiatrist who sees, as well as other clinicians who meet regularly to discuss and see if you're making progress, then what is the thing that you need to do? How do you improve your own skills? Case supervisions happen. So the stages of treatment are roughly around this, where initial 4 to 6 weeks, you only work to orient them to DBT, identify goals, kind of improve their motivation. This is mostly individual therapy sessions with mostly individual therapy sessions. Then the stage 1, where the chief focus is to reduce life-threatening behaviors. Life-threatening behaviors are your self-harm, suicidal behaviors. Therapy interfering behaviors, you would have clients who would miss sessions, come late for sessions, like half an hour, 40 minutes late. I don't mean a 10-minute delay in a session. They turn up 45 minutes late and expect you to see them for extra 1 hour. Usually you would work through that. Then you also have behaviors like coming up. I've not had this experience, but this is something that a lot of other literature talks about, turning up drunk for the session. In my case, it's mostly been clients who have missed sessions, getting them to come in for frequent sessions, or they have come in very late. Severe quality of life interfering behaviors. This is again that I said, substance use. If they have any other health conditions which require to be treated, concern, you need to refer them to appropriate general physicians for treatment, or even unemployment. Sometimes that's a very strong thing that happens. In this stage 1 is where you have individual DBT, you have their skills training that goes simultaneously, and a bit of phone coaching where you call and remind them of helping them and getting them into therapy. The stage 2 is symptom reduction. Mostly people with borderline have other, and I don't mean necessarily only trauma, eating disorders, or mood and anxiety, but they have a lot of other symptoms which are anxiety and depression, which you would work with. And the last stage is where you start working on the self-esteem, their relationship difficulties, work into problem solving chiefly, right? And improve their quality of life. Now, the core DBT strategies, like I mentioned, we had acceptance and problem solving. In acceptance, you are trying to get the client to understand their emotions, their thoughts, and their actions. I know this is a slight repetition, but what I want to emphasize here is, how do you validate? Now, there are a few things that have to do in a therapy session to validate a client. It's not just saying, oh, I understand this was happening with you. It requires you to actively listen to the client. What are they saying? What is it that they're not saying, but something that you have to infer from what they're saying, right? I'll give you an example here. So one of the days I remember with my client Tara was, I had, like I said, those were the gap days. So in that particular day, I was a bit in a rush. I had to see other clients, and there was somebody else kind of some other crisis that I was solving. So she saw me running around and kind of busy. So she didn't come and say hi. She just saw me, and I knew this in the next day's session. She told me, I saw you yesterday, and you looked like you were busy and you were stressed out. And I said, yeah, that was just a different client, and we had a crisis. It got done there. But then that session, she didn't talk much. We just discussed a little, and it went on. It left me thinking afterwards whether she stopped saying things to me because now was there something else that she understood from that? Because I hadn't even seen her. Now, did she feel like I ignored her? Was there something else she's trying to tell me when she brought this up? I didn't realize it in that session, but I brought it up in the next session, and I asked her, Tara, is there something, you brought this up, and I was wondering what happened, what was the context in which you brought this up? It seemed to have bothered you in some way. And though I was thinking that it's possibly because I didn't notice her, I missed her, and that she's feeling bad that I ignored her or rejected her, that was not the case. But when I asked her, she actually said that, I saw that you have so many things happening, and I didn't want to burden you with what I was feeling. So I didn't come up and tell you what I was going through. Now that it was different, but I noticed the reason she brought it up, there must be some reason. So it helped when I checked and I spoke to her about it. So that's a part of validation, to know that you've noticed something, you want to understand what's happening, and that gives the client a feeling that she's safe, she can speak to you. She or he, sorry about that. Accurate reflection, which is reflecting their emotions back to them and making sure that you are tentative and you're approaching. You may have a couple of questions, but you can always be tentative in your expression, and they might be able to understand it. Understand the historical perspective is when you use the person's history to understand and validate it. Now, suppose, not in this client's case, but in other clients, sometimes they get angry and they throw things down. They broke something. And if you know that from their perspective, as in when they were a child, when they told their parents that, I'm upset, listen to me, I want this, they never heard them. But instead, when this person broke things around the house, then they got the attention and got things what they wanted. So that may be a pattern they're following up into adulthood. And you can understand that she's trying to say, or he's trying to say something that, this is the only way in which I will get your attention. So understand their history and connect it with their current behavior. What is valid in their, whether it's the emotion, whether it's the motivation, validate that. And you can be respectfully honest. So while you're saying that, like I said with Tara, I understand where you're coming from, and I understand that you're feeling very upset and that it was so distressing for you that you had to cut yourself. But do you think there would have been a more effective way to handle that rather than hurting yourself? Because I'm being honest with her. I'm not hiding and saying I'm not going to talk about the self-harm at all, but I'm going to respect her decision to come up with something. Now, moving on to problem-solving strategies, we are talking about how there's a change-based. You're talking about analyzing behavior. It's kind of like your ABC analysis that we do in CVT. You have an antecedent, behavior, and consequence, except that you add a few more things to this. As a part of it, after analyzing behavior, you would commit to a change, and then you take steps, like you break it down on how you're going to get the change. One of the core strategies used for problem solving is chain analysis. So here is where I'm saying it's basically your ABC analysis, antecedent, behavior, consequence, but with a small change of situation. We add a few more things to it. So you examine the events, the factors that are leading up to the response. And I'll talk more about chain analysis when I'm talking about emotion regulation. So in the DBT skills, we have mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. While I say these are the 4 different skills that you have, these are not practiced, or these are not done specifically. Like what I mean to say is that it's like, first I will teach my client mindfulness. Once mindfulness is over, then I will teach distress tolerance. Once distress tolerance is over, then it doesn't happen like that. It really cannot happen like that because the person comes with so many difficulties. And sometimes your first aim will be to tackle distress tolerance with the person. And when you're doing distress tolerance, you might incorporate some aspects of mindfulness for the individual, so that because mindfulness is also helpful in coming to terms with what's your emotion and how do you regulate it. So you incorporate mindfulness and you combine it with distress tolerance, and sometimes you may end up also regulating emotion for a while. And if they are having difficulties in relationships with parents, with their spouse, or with anybody else, with their friends, and that's urgently something that you need to decide and you have to work on, you might even take aspects of interpersonal effectiveness. You might also work on their interpersonal relationships. So while mindfulness and distress tolerance are parts of your acceptance-oriented strategies, emotion regulation and interpersonal effectiveness are chiefly your change-oriented strategies. Now, I'm moving to mindfulness. What is mindfulness? Mindfulness is when you do one thing in the present moment, giving it your full attention and acceptance. So though it's kind of simply put into a definition, it's one of the most difficult things that you can do. If for people who have practiced mindfulness, you know that it doesn't happen quickly. It takes a while to be able to be mindful in your actions. So what all does mindfulness help with? It helps you to be in charge, take control of your mind. It helps to improve emotion regulation. It will allow increased behavior control. It will reduce, by that I mean, it will reduce impulsivity. So there is a gap between the thought and the action. You stop, you pause, you think. So that mindfulness helps you achieve. It improves memory concentration. It helps in relaxation and engaging in life in general. So when you practice mindfulness, a simple way of doing it is to choose an activity. And then you focus completely on the activity. Now, activity could be something as simple as, say, not necessarily coloring. You could be chopping vegetables, right? Or like during the pandemic now, a lot of people have gotten into baking. So the whole idea of baking, cooking, you're going to be mindful of that activity. When you are gardening, you can be mindful, right? You can be mindful with any activity. Forget it. You can even be mindful while sipping your coffee in a day. So you focus completely on the activity. And by focus, I mean use all your senses. Look at the color. So if it's coffee, you look at the color of the coffee. You take in the aroma of it. You feel the heat when you hold the cup, right? The touch. And then you take your first sip, play it around, put it around in your, swirl it around your tongue. Kind of, how people say you should drink wine. The wine tasters talk about it. Drink coffee with that much and you are being very mindful about it. The flavor, the texture of coffee in your mouth. You can do any task could be done mindfully. The point is when you do this task and you're focusing on it, whenever you notice that your mind is wandering away, and like we give instructions, it will wander away. Bring it back. Slowly bring it back and start concentrating on the activity again. And that's all the practice keeps happening, right? You have formal and informal mindfulness practices, which include counting breaths, observing sounds, how you feel in your body, what's happening. Like, even right now, you could be sitting and you could not just hear me speak, not only look at the screen, but also try and understand what's happening to your shoulders. Is there tension there? How do your clothes feel on you? Is there a fan running around in your room? What is happening to you? You can still be mindful now. Or it could be in a task in terms of focusing on a thought. Okay, when this thought happens, what's happening in with me? What are the other related thoughts? Just observing it. So mindfulness, we talk about the what skills and the how skills. This is something that you will teach them. And often this is done in a group. And in an individual setting, you teach them this. And ideally, you're supposed to be reinforcing it. But yeah, in our conditions, it's mostly individual. So you will teach your client these. The what skills include observing, describing, participating. So you're just supposed to be noticing what's happening around you. Don't label it, don't judge it, just observe, right? The second part of it is when you're describing it, use words to describe. So I am noticing that I'm anxious, or I'm noticing that I'm thirsty, or I think, or I'm noticing, or I'm observing that I'm feeling a little angry. All of that is just used with words to describe what you're feeling. You're describing it. Now you integrate your observing and describing in what you're doing. So stay in the now. So right now, say for example, right now I'm speaking to all of you and I've described what I'm observing is I'm looking at my environment. I'm quite comfortable, but I also observing that I'm mindful of the time. I need to ensure that this is happening. So there's a mild anxiety, and I know that that's happening in the back of my head, but I still focus on what's happening right now, and I continue with the presentation. Just an example there. The how skills. The how skills include being non-judgmental. So you being trying to say that what, there is no good, bad, unwanted, unwelcome thoughts at all. You're being effective, where you're applying it into applying your mindfulness skills in practice, right? And you keep practicing it so that every time you feel you get a thought or an impulse, you pause and then act. So you're widening the gap between the thought and the action, more effective. That's effective. And one mindful, where you focus on one thing, which means you're not multitasking, you're not having several things going on simultaneously, but you are focusing on a single task at a time. These what and how skills, slightly, part of it you may be using in the beginning, but some parts of it you may use it only much later. Now, this three styles of thinking, the emotional mind, the logical or rational mind, and the wise mind, is definitely something that I have felt is better when you bring it up later in therapy rather than in the beginning. It becomes a little too complicated in the beginning. Because the concept is that we all have an emotional mind where we only feel things, it's very affective, and we work on our emotions. It's our emotions that drive our actions. It's the emotions that drive our reactions, rather. And you have the logical mind, which is going to sit and think about the consequences, the cause and effect. It's like, okay, if I do this, in the long run, this is what will happen. In the short run, this is what is going to happen. It does all the analysis. And some people either focus only on the rational mind and some focus only on the emotional mind. Focusing on either alone is not helpful, because emotions also have a role. They do tell you things and you need to pay attention to it. But without having a logical mind to combine it with, you may not make the best use of the information that your emotions are giving you. So the wise mind is a process in which you are synthesizing or combining the emotional mind and the logical mind. It's quite difficult. It's very easy to talk about it in simple theory, but it's not as easy to practice. Now, mindfulness also helps you in reducing emotional reactivity. How does it do this? Because while it helps you to access the wise mind, right? So with mindfulness practice, what you do is something like mental noting. You notice and observe and describe your emotions. You don't judge your emotions, right? You improve your self-talk. There are a lot of people whose clients, and when you talk to them, you understand that they say, I'm a horrible person. How could I have done something like that? There's a lot of negative self-talk that they have. So you get them to talk about it more positively, changing it. Oh, I forgot to do something. That's unfortunate. But rather than saying, yes, I'm a bad person because I forgot it. So you change their self-talk, well, not by admitting that they're all right, but by telling them that this is helpful enough. I mean, this is try to modify it slightly. Then we have the just this moment. There is being in the moment. All of this helps us being in the present rather than in the past or the future, helps us in accessing the wise mind. Along with accessing the wise mind, the other thing that helps reduce emotional reactivity is the lifestyle, which helps you in managing their emotional regulation. One is sleep. If you have less than 7 hours of sleep, any of us notice that if you have slept less for a day, we are more irritable. If we have a headache, if we have a cold, if you're feeling feverish and tired, that affects our mood. That affects how much we can, listen, and how much we can take in, how irritable we become, how angry we become, all of that is affected by your physical illnesses. If you've skipped a meal, it's not just a meal. If you skipped 2 to 3 meals, that also affects our mood. Right? Similarly, exercise and mood altering. Now, all of these are applicable to any of us, where if we have a problem in any of this, this can affect our moods, our vulnerability to dysregulation, and so on. So imagine a person who's already highly emotionally vulnerable. So then this becomes all the more important for these individuals, right? So these are things that you would work upon. Now, the second part that we're talking about skills are the distress tolerance skills. The distress tolerance skills have different ways. One is to resist the urge, manage the urge, and coping. One of the things with DBT is you find there are several acronyms that are used, which are to easily remember a particular skill that has been taught, right? That's the whole idea of bringing this up. Now, for example, the idea of distress tolerance. Now, one of the chief things you have to understand about distress tolerance is it does not take away the emotion. So if you're upset, if you're sad, doing a distress tolerance skill will not take away the sadness or the anger. It doesn't take it away completely. What it does do is it brings down the intensity of the emotion to a level which is now manageable for you, where you don't feel the strong need to react. It will only bring down. It's like, so what I will give you an example of is, think about a bucket that's being filled with water, right? And sometimes it starts overflowing, and that's your overwhelming emotional dysregulation. The water's flowing out everywhere. So when you're doing the distress tolerance skill, you're not emptying the bucket. What you instead do is maybe turn off the tap, pull out a single mug of water so that it stops overflowing. And that's all you do, right? You don't take it away. If the idea is not to get rid of it. But now that the water flow has stopped, you can manage the other things a little better. You stop water from overflowing. That's it. So you don't get overwhelmed. You've just reduced the intensity to a level that you can now manage. And this is something that you need to explain to your client. Because I remember, not with Tara, but with other clients, initially when I was doing this, I would teach them a distress tolerance skill and I would ask them to practice it. And then they said, it was not effective. At the end of it, I still felt upset. And that's when it struck me that, the whole point is not to take it away. The point is just to bring it to a level where now you can act appropriately instead of acting in a highly inappropriate manner that was aimed at a sudden reduction of the emotion. You can now manage to do it more effectively, right? So the different things is you can reframe, you can get them to engage in an activity mindfully when they do some activity for someone else, self-soothing, and you think neutral thoughts, divert your mind to something like that, or take a break. Now for Tara, what worked here was, it was difficult for her to reframe in the beginning, okay? But what helped her really, and it really helped her, was the self-soothing techniques. Now in self-soothing, you use your senses to calm yourself, soothe yourself, a lot of patting or maybe touching something that's soft, or any kind of a feeling, right? A fragrance that you like, which is comforting, a taste that is comforting. So in Tara's case, I remember her keeping, a bottle of a perfume that she found extremely soothing. She smelled different kinds of perfumes, and she picked out one small one, which she said, this helps me soothe down. So every time she got distressed, she would spray a little bit of it on her, on her palm, and then she would smell it, on her wrist actually, and then she would smell it, and she would sit, and she said, okay, now I'm focusing on the smell. She also had a stuffed toy with her, which she would keep holding on to. She would put it into it. Now imagine she's a person in her late 20s, but she still had a stuffed toy and she would hold on to it. Patting it, rubbing the stuffed toy was something that really helped her. She chose 2 of those. The other thing that she was able to do was engage in an activity very mindfully. Now she had a skill. Okay, one of the things that I kept saying is, when you talk about improving capabilities, enhancing it, Tara was very good artist. She would love to paint, sketch. So she would start coloring. Initially, she wasn't ready to draw and sketch. So what we did was got her one of those adult coloring books, and then she would color that. And she would sit and she would only color with a pencil. So we did all of this in the session first. We would sit with her in the session, and then she would color a particular segment very carefully. And then when I noticed that she's getting distracted or her mind has gone off, I would draw attention initially and say, come on, Tara, like, come back to the task at hand. Then she would go back to it. And we did this for a while, right? Till she could practice it outside the session. So that's the first part, resisting the urge. Now, the second part happens in between sessions. So when you rate the intensity, first time you're feeling an emotion, something is happening, you rate how strong it is. You set an alarm for about 5 minutes. That's what I did with Tara. It set it for 5 minutes because that was the duration she could focus on things. And then and during that 5 minutes, she will do 1 or 2 of the distress tolerance tasks, skills that she thought was helpful. Then she would rate again. And if she says it's not significantly reduced, then she will set the alarm again and then do this again till it reduces, right? So this is something that happened. Then other part of it is to prepare for upcoming situations. So when you know something is going to be stressful, you know this might be something that is difficult for you. Especially in her case, there were situations where she had to have conversations or negotiations with her father about permissions to go out of the hospital or get things for herself. And she knew that was always met with resistance from her father. So she would go prepared. Like, you know what, when I speak to him, I'm going to get upset. So I'm going to have all these things in my hand. I'm not going to go without being prepared. And then she would use it. She would have the conversation. She would continue using her skills and come back. Of course, this didn't happen in the first month. This happened way only into the second month. So just giving you a head that it doesn't happen very soon with these clients. Moving on to emotion regulation. This is the change-oriented parts. The first part of it is where we tell them about how to get to know their emotions, what is happening. Some of them, I'm not sure whether, so with a lot of borderline clients, what you also notice is that they do not have the verbal or vocabulary to explain their emotions. And this may not be only borderline clients, but a lot of them don't even have the vocabulary or the fact that they don't even recognize emotions that happen to them. So the first task is to say, okay, you're feeling, and they always use, I'm stressed out or I'm upset. And then you're like, okay, what does that mean? What does stressed out mean? Do you mean you're getting angry? Do you mean you're getting anxious? Do you mean you're feeling sad? What is it? Or is it a mix of all of this? I don't know. You're saying stressed. So for them to get to know what's happening, sometimes it helps to locate it in their body. Where are you feeling this emotion? Well, what is happening in your body? So some of them would tell you that, I'm feeling butterflies in my stomach, or I feel this very tight knot, on my shoulder, near my neck. The nape is very tight and I don't know what's happening. Or some of them say, I feel like my ears are burning and I notice that I'm clenching. So you can use physiological or bodily sensations to help them to recognize that there is an emotion that's happening within them, right? Then you give them a vocabulary. For naming emotions, give them an emotion wheel. Give them with a lot of emotions and saying, now pick what you're feeling here. Is this what you feel? Is this what you feel initially, right? And then talk about regulating it. Because if you don't know what you're feeling, if you are not able to identify what it is that you're feeling, how do you deal with that emotion? So as a part to regulate emotions, you have mindfulness, self-validation. They need to acknowledge, love, and understand what they're feeling. They have to say, you know what? It's okay for me to feel angry. It's all right that I'm feeling angry right now. And I understand that I am upset with something. Then what? Because then you go to the next step. If you're not allowing yourself to feel, you suppress it, it doesn't really help in getting an effective reaction or effective behavior out of what you felt. Then accepting reality, acting opposite to urges. Oh, sorry, when we talk about accepting reality, I forgot to mention that, sometimes they come in, your clients would say that, when I know I'm not going to improve, I've accepted that reality. That is not a reality. It has not even happened. So how do you accept something that has not happened? And that's something that you have to remind them. She understands that if they say that, what, I accept I have problems with emotional regulation, or I accept that I tend to be impulsive. That is something that has happened. That is something you can talk about. And that is acceptance. I don't think I will ever get better. So I've accepted that reality. That is not true because it's not happened yet, right? So that's something you'll have to remind your clients when they say things like that. Don't mistake accepting reality for when they say that they're hopeless. Don't say it's the same thing. Acting opposite to urges. Sometimes you have them saying that, what I feel like doing is withdrawing, not talking to anybody. And that's when you say, what, maybe try doing the opposite of that. Actually go and talk to somebody outside. I don't feel like doing anything. I'm not going to do. just go take a shower. Don't do anything much. Just do something opposite, right? Or I get so angry that I want to break something. And you do the opposite. Don't touch the object, move away from it. So, kind of figure out what could be opposite to urges that they feel. Watch emotions. Watch is again an acronym. One where you have to watch emotions. You don't act, avoid acting. Kind of think of emotions as a wave. Now, if you worked with people with substance use, one of the things that you talk about, craving as a wave. This is very similar. You think of emotions as a wave. They will crest. There'll be a place where it's the highest, and then it will come down. Just wait and watch. And they can choose to experience pleasurable things. It's not like your life has been riddled with bad things. Even if you're having a bad day, you can choose to have a good experience. You can choose to do something that will make you feel good, right? So that's something that you tell them to do. And that emotions actually help you understand things better about yourself, about a situation. They're not supposed to be rejected or thrown away, but they are essential and important. Increase positive experiences and also develop a kind of positive attitude. One of the things that you do is have this kind of a emotion regulation. This is a diary that you ask them to maintain, where they talk about help them identify what are the typical bodily responses for various emotions. What would be the thoughts or memories or images that would come up when they are angry or when they're happy or when they're sad? When you're having this emotion, what would you feel like doing? And what do you actually do? Is what you feel like doing what you do the same? Are they different? When they track this, they will be able to understand it. And also, what are the consequences of those? I'd mentioned that I'll come back to chain analysis when we're talking about emotion regulation. This is basically your ABC analysis, like I was saying. So you see that the prompting event is your antecedent, behavior is the same, and C is the consequence. The difference here is that we've added vulnerability and something that we consider as links. So what links the antecedent to the behavior is the links that you see here. Okay. Below it, I've explained what each of it is. Now, when we talk about vulnerability, we're talking about whether they are sick, they've been having fever, they've been ill for some time, but they're tired, they've been hungry, they've been facing stressful events, have they had a drink or have they used any drugs in the past? All of this becomes a vulnerability. And then the event happens, and then you have the links. What connects the prompting event to the behavior would be the thoughts, the beliefs, the attributions they make, the emotions that they feel, their bodily sensations are the links. And then you have the problem behavior, and then you have the consequences. Consequences would be to set themselves to the other person, whether short-term, long-term, all of that becomes your consequences. Now, the chain analysis is a strategic part to identify how problem behaviors manifest, how does it result. So in terms of self-harm, this is extremely helpful. Now, another thing that you see classically with a lot of borderline clients is the fact that when you ask them, what made you cut yourself? They probably would say, I don't know. I just felt like it and I just cut myself. Or I don't know what made me cut. And then you were like, okay, what happened? So I was just feeling bad the whole day. It's like the whole day, did you wake up feeling bad? And then sometimes they would say yes, sometimes they would say no. So if they say, no, I did not wake up feeling bad, then your question is, okay, so what happened after you woke up? Walk me through it, right? So they don't know what led to it. They don't have the ability to recognize what happened. You will have to walk them through every step till the act happened. Now, in that way, sometimes they say, no, I woke up angry. I was very irritated when I woke up. Okay, did you go to sleep angry? And then they might say, yes, I had an argument with my parents and I didn't know, I was very angry with them. So I turned around and slept trying to get rid of it. But then when I woke up, I had a disturbed sleep, so it didn't work. So you already have disturbed sleep, stressful event in the past as vulnerability already marked. Then what happened in the day? Then as I was talking to my friend, I wanted to talk to my friend about this. I called my friend and she didn't answer the phone. So when she didn't answer the phone, I felt extremely bad and I cut myself. Now you say, hold on a minute. So when your friend didn't answer the call, you said you felt extremely bad. What was making you feel bad? No, she didn't have time for me. She could have. So that's when you generate the beliefs and thoughts with the person. And then I felt she doesn't care about me. And at the end of the day, no one cares about me. So then why should I even live? And that led me to cut myself. So you see how that gets translated? You figure out the vulnerability. You know, you don't even know what the prompting event is. Even they don't know. You need to walk them through it. Find the link, because the links are the ones that actually help you deal with the problem solving behavior. Because this is where you start teaching them distress tolerance. This is the place where while you work on emotional vulnerability, reducing it, the links are the place where you actually do the problem solving. You change that. And so you change the consequences also in a way. Okay. Now we move on to interpersonal effectiveness, which was one of the last module that we talk about. So interpersonal effectiveness is because, like I mentioned, in borderline clients, they have relationship instability, they have frantic fears of abandonment, and they try efforts to avoid abandonment, right? Even self-harm, all of this will affect a relationship a lot. So what you need to first do is assess the social support. By this, I mean that, your client may have 500 friends on Facebook and might have 1,200 followers on Twitter or Instagram for that matter. I mean, but are these the people that they can reach out to? Is there anybody whom they can reach out to at a time of crisis? Who can they talk to about it? Have they tried reaching out? So you need to assess what this person's social support is like currently, right? And then you try to work on improving current relationships. Okay, so this person's system is not very strong, or they have only one or two people in it. Now let's first improve these relationships with these people, because there are conflicts even in the closest relationships. Let's try working on them. Help the person understand and describe things. Help them express themselves more effectively. So you work on that. You work on the communication styles. How are they saying what they're saying? Are they really saying what they feel, or are they saying something else? Are they covering it up? So those become important for us to address. Assertiveness skills. Now, this Dear Man is basically an acronym for assertiveness skills. How do you say what you want and get what you want is what they say. So Dear, you have the describe, express, assert, and reinforce. So what describe means you describe what is it that you want. Express how you feel about it. And then you say, I would like this. And say, it would be great if you would be able to, if you'd allow me to do this, or it would be great if you agree to this particular thing. So you are not only describing what you want, you're expressing how you feel about it. You're stating it. You're not asking for permission. Say, can I do this? I'm not sure. I would like to do this. Would you let me? And reinforce it, right? The man part is you also need to be mindful of what's happening. What might the other person be feeling? Appear confident and also negotiate. Now, the person says, no, you can't do it. Then what else can you do? So in Tara's case, I can give you an example with one of the situations where she wanted to talk to her. She wanted to go out of the hospital to a nearby stationery store to buy pencils, some color pencils and a notebook. I think for sketching, she wanted it. And her father was somebody who never wanted to let her go alone. He really wanted to watch over her. Now, the reasons for that is that every time she has kind of gone alone or she's been alone, she's called up people who the father doesn't approve her having a relationship with or talking to, and she's been doing it secretively. So the father was afraid of all of that, and he keeps saying, don't go alone, I'll come with you. Now, for her to do this, it took a lot of practice and role playing, where I kept asking her to describe what she wanted. How can she negotiate? So the thing she said, she practiced all the description that she would like to go alone to the stationery store, and it would give her a feeling of independence and would feel good if she's able to do this. So please, I'll be extremely happy if you could, let me go alone. And she was mindful that her father may not like the idea, that he might be irritated. He would say no. In fact, he did say no. So then she was prepared to say that, okay, what are you afraid of that I will do? Or what is it that's bothering you? And he was saying, you always do all this. I can't trust you, things like that. And then she said, okay, I will leave my phone with you. I will take only the money that is required for me to go to buy this. And I will come back within 15 to 20 minutes. That seemed to kind of be okay with the father, because we had also had family therapy and he understood she's trying to do something different and allowed her. But this We did, I think for 2 sessions, we completely role played it. She kept improving it. And then she tried it with her father on the 3rd day. So it was a long process again. And like we said, work on the current relationships and also how to develop new ones and how to help them. Now, that brings us to the different skills and the different kinds of tech strategies that are used in DBT. What is another important thing is to understand what is the therapist stance. What should a therapist do in here? Are you only teaching skills, or is there something that you as a therapist need to be? So like I mentioned, validation. Like I keep saying validate, 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 because it is an extremely important part in DBT. And this is something that your skill books may not talk about as much, but if you read Linehan's Cognitive Behavior Therapy for Borderline, the book she wrote first, you will have a lot of this explained in detail, her philosophy and the dialectics and acceptance and change. So the thing is, validation is essential for people. It's very essential for individuals with BPD. They've never received validation in their life. It helps to build your therapeutic alliance. They start understanding, they get the idea that, oh, this person understands me. This person gets me. Literally gets me is what it is. Right? And that's essential for yours. It reduces their distress. It's like, okay, this person understands. Maybe it helps me to talk about it, or maybe they will be able to help me reduce it. Maybe because they understand what I'm going through, their suggestions or recommendations may be valid. It might be applicable. It's not some random thing that they're saying. It reduces polarization. It reduces the split, idealization and devaluation that we talk about. That is reduced. They don't start seeing things in black and white. It's important to get their cooperation, of course, right? And when you validate, you have to validate and emphasize client control. That's another important aspect. Do not rush to take care of the client. They are not children to be taken care of. Okay, you have to reinforce their ability and their belief that they can handle their problems, right? Don't reinforce dysfunctional behavior, but validate that they have the capacity to behave reasonably. It's not like they don't, oh, they can't, they're absolutely done, and you don't rush to take care of them. Here is to take an approach which, in parenting, they call scaffolding, where the person has not attained a particular skill or they may not be able to do something. And what you do is give them a small, kind of a push up, where you kind of give them, like when someone's climbing a wall, you just give them a base to keep their foot and climb up. They can't do it alone, so you just allow them. You don't lift and put them across. You only provide them a base to press their leg and climb up, a shoulder to step on before they climb up. Something like that's called scaffolding. It's in the buildings, where temporarily they put up those small things where they can, so that they can do the rest of the construction, something like that. Remember that you have to accept the person. So this is where it happens. I know a lot of mental health professionals say they're manipulative, they're so difficult to deal with. This person has so many problems, but accept the individual, understand that they have gone through a difficult history, which you may not have the same experience with, but they've had an experience where they have not been seen. They've had an experience where they were not heard. They've had an experience where they were not, their opinions were not having a space. So there are things that they're doing right now, which is influenced by all that. Accept the individual. Yes, just like they have to accept that they have difficulties, we need to accept that this person has a lot of difficulties and we need to work with it. Structure and boundaries. I mentioned about structure earlier, where I was talking about having consistency in terms of meeting times, communication patterns. See, so everybody, when you're working with a borderline client, it doesn't mean that you give them your phone number and said, call me whenever you want. Some of you may not want to give your numbers to them because there are times when they would call incessantly, right? But what helps is to tell them that, you know what, I may not be available on the phone. I cannot answer your phone calls. So when you're in a crisis, I'm not the person you need to reach out to. But however, if you're having a crisis, this is the person you can reach out to, or this is the place you can go to. This is the emergency hospital where you can go, where your file is there. This will help you out. So that's structure. And that is very helpful for clients with borderline. In terms of boundaries, boundaries are very essential. Remember that when you set boundaries with the client, they are not rigid fences. As I said, fences, not frames. I mean, they're frames, not fences. So don't have rigid boundaries. Remember that some of them may be a little movable, right? A little flexible depending upon your client's needs. You don't want them calling you every day, but you feel like, okay, this is a particular client who may need your phone number to reach out in terms of crisis. So at that point, what you can do is kind of set a time saying that if you have a crisis and you're calling me, we can speak for 15 minutes. It's not like saying, no, I will not give my number to any of my borderline clients. You give it to a few people and say, okay, if you're a crisis, call me, but I can only spend 15 minutes with you. That's my availability. Or that when you call, I may not be, I will get back to you. Small adjustments and boundaries are allowed, but depending upon what your client, don't take it completely allow. Oh, you know what, they need it, so I will have no boundaries. Call me any time of the day. Because without boundaries, your self-care is also affected. You need a break. So when talking about boundaries and management, I just thought I'll give you talk about this particular situation where if during a session the client is talking to you about a lot of self-harm urges and saying, I've been feeling like I want to cut myself, I want to kill myself, there's a lot of suicidal, and the therapist says, you know what, we've worked on how you can handle it. I don't think hospitalization is going to help you. But before the client leaves, the client says, you know what, if you don't hospitalize me for the weekend, I'm going to kill myself. Now, do you think that the client is being manipulative? Do you feel that what should be done in this situation? If you actually respond to the suicide threat that the person is giving, are you reinforcing a behavior? Right? Now, these are a lot of things that often happen. You wonder whether you should or should not hospitalize. Remember, and for this, let me tell you that there's no clear-cut answer. You need a lot more information. But however, remember that when you're hospitalizing, it's only for safe treatment. It's the least restrictive method. Because for borderline clients, long-term hospitalization is harmful. It does not, it's not really beneficial for them. If you feel that the person is at risk, then you use hospitalization for a short period, right? Especially if the risk for suicide outweighs inappropriate hospitalization. So every time somebody says that they are threatening suicide, if you admit them, you put them into a hospital, it is not really helpful for the person because the person is completely removed. A hospital setting is where the person is completely removed from my, reality. The person has a different controlled environment, the nursing staff, the doctors there, the therapists there, everybody is going to be fine and comfortable for them to be in. Their outside world is not as nice or as sensitive or as tolerant of their behaviors. So they're not really learning to generalize what they've learned in the hospital outside if they don't spend the time outside. And you are taking away their control, saying that, you know what, you cannot do anything, so we will only take care of you. Instead, the aim of DBT is to tell them that you have the capacity to be better. You have the capacity to be reasonable. You have the capacity to do better. And we will, increase the possibilities by us providing you with some support. So your aim is to help them cope in their natural environment, right? So that. Almost towards the end, so I just want to say how you put this up together. One, you start with skills, which is very concrete, which is very specific. You start teaching them skills. It's something that they can hold on to. The complicated stuff like assertiveness or, even not assertiveness, I would say interpersonal problems that you're going to deal with, or your, wise mind and how to use that, or even the change in behavior through emotion regulation, I would say keep that a little for the last. The self-esteem part, the fragility of their identity, all of that is worked on towards the end, because you would have initially worked with the mood, you would have kind of stabilized them, and then move to it. Have a team. Have a team because it's essential. Handling a client with BPD by yourself is extremely difficult. And this, I'm also telling you from my personal experience, that during PhD, if I did not have a team of psychiatrists, social workers, supervisor to help me handle my clients, it would have, I mean, Despite that, with the number, I've had burnout places. So trust me when I say that if you don't have a team while working with a borderline, get a team, form it, have constant discussions, talk about the progress, talk about how you can handle it differently. You need the support network. You need, and a person with borderline responds better when there are multiple people taking care of them. It increases their social support in a large way, right? It's not, you're not the only person. So they're not dependent only on you. They also have other people. So they don't, so one of the things that they talk about is, I'm so dependent on you. What will I do without you? So now you have other people that they can also rely on, and you can draw that as example. See, you have a good relationship with your psychiatrist. You have an amazing relationship with your group therapist. And look at the family work. That's also a place you can go. So you have, like, now you have 4 people whom you're working with. See, so it's not, I might be the person who's working with you for a longer period, but we have people. So it helps that individual also to feel stabilized, feel cared for, right? And these are some basic assumptions that I think as therapists, as professionals in mental health, we all need to keep in mind, that the client is doing their best. Like, they're trying their hardest to get better, and they want to get better, right? But of course, they need to work a little harder. They need to be motivated to make changes, but they are trying their best. Please remember that. And sometimes even the client says, none of this is mine. No, it's all created by people around me. And it may be true. In that case, it's still, just because it's not something that they created, they will still have to solve it. That's what all of us do. Sometimes problems are not created by us, but we need to solve them nonetheless. Remember that the lives of suicidal clients are unbearable. It is so difficult for them. It's terrible. It's horrible. It's not an experience that a lot of people understand. It's a very overwhelming emotion that you would have to go through, that they would go through, right? And be sensitive to that. The clients need to act skillfully. And remember that your client does not fail therapy. You can't say that, I saw them for a year of DBT and now they did not recover, so they have failed DBT. You never fail DBT, or for that matter, I would say any therapy. Your clients will not fail it. It's not a test. They may not be ready for it yet, but you are trying to increase their readiness for therapy. And just like everybody else, therapists treating clients with any sort of dysregulated emotions, you need support yourself. You need to take self-care. Understand that some ways in which you can do this is, right after their session, have a break. Ensure that you do not have anybody else very closely packed. Suppose you have a 1-hour session with a client. Ensure that the next session starts after half an hour to 45 minutes at least. I'll give you an example, because with a recent experience of mine, I was seeing a client with borderline traits, but also had a lot of trauma. And I remember as soon as I was sitting through the session, there was a lot of emotions that I had to deal with, a lot of calmness. I have to instill calmness in the client. And post the session, I realized I'm exhausted. And it was just by luck that my next session was an hour later. So I was able to go take a sip of water, walk around. Honestly, I actually had a piece of chocolate, because that really was something I needed at that point. I was feeling drained. They can be difficult, but you need to do the self-care immediately after the session, right? If you're seeing the client over long periods of time, you need to feel motivated to see the client, because the gains are slow. They're not as obvious or very, easily noticeable as others. So that is the other thing that we need to do. Maintain a journal, self-reflection, right? Also, personal therapy will be something that I highly recommend. I think for any therapy, being in personal therapy helps. But I think when you're working with clients with borderline or severe emotional dysregulation, it always helps to have your own therapy, so that you don't bring your personal things into the session with these clients who are already very emotionally vulnerable, right? So self-care is at them very important. Take breaks between work, not just on a daily basis, or you'd work on yourself, but take breaks, take vacations, take a few days off, unwind. Don't keep your cell phones on. You don't have to constantly be answering phone calls. So these are things that you really need to start doing, because your mental health also counts. And if you want to be an effective therapist to deal with people with more complicated issues, you need to know how to take care of yourself. And I think that brings us, thank you, everybody. Just a few references, simple things that I have used. So I think with that, we've completed the presentation. If there are any questions.
Thank you, Dharni. Sorry, I was not able to log in earlier, so I had come in through the mobile. Luckily, it helped. Now my laptop is working. Yeah, excellent presentation. I missed about 5 minutes, but excellent presentation.
Thank you.
So we will go through the questions. There are already a few questions in the chat box. I would suggest that participants please type your questions in the chat box so that it's easier to moderate the questions. The first question is from Mr. Arab Jan. He says whether DBT will be effective for patients with ADHD, PTSD, or is it only for BPD?
So that's quite an interesting question. I'll tell you that it's very effective for people with PTSD also. In fact, a lot of trauma work does work on emotion regulation and distress tolerance. You can use elements of DBT for trauma work. This is depending upon whether, when you say PTSD, PTSD would also have flashbacks, which means you'll have to work with it slightly differently. But yes, DBT elements can be used. Mindfulness is a common element that's used in trauma therapy. It's very effective in that manner. For ADHD, again, elements, because a different way of approaching mindfulness, a different way of emotion regulation can be used. I wouldn't say that, yes, DBT cannot be used, but it is not in its true sense, DBT may not be ideal for ADHD. However, you can use elements, like I said, mindfulness. Now, in my client that I was talking about, she also had ADHD. So other than medication, for Tara, what helped was the mindful practices we had. It helped her kind of sustain attention longer, concentrate better. So it does have those effects. If you're focusing only on attention deficits, then maybe you'll have to incorporate it with other training also. Attention training would also be required for ADHD. Similarly, for PTSD also, you would have to use methods to handle flashbacks, which DBT doesn't really explain, but something where you're helping them to integrate trauma will be an addition. I hope I've answered this question.
Integrating trauma counseling as well as DBT elements, yes. The next question is from Jennifer. She's a student of MPhil Clinical Psychology. There are two questions. Can couple therapy by another therapist be used as adjunct therapy? If so, what stage can it be included? That's the first question.
Okay. So for that, I would say that recommend actually that a person with borderline, if they're coming in, couple therapy, family therapy, is required for the person, because one is that the person, though the person themselves are creating, there might be problems. It's not always the person alone that's the problematic source. You're not this is why this is slightly different from CBT, because you're not centering the difficulties in the individual. It is also saying that your environment is important and it needs to be addressed. So yes, couple therapy has been effective, and family therapy has also been effective, because most of the clients that have come in, as far as I understand, in my contact, have been people who have been brought in by parents. They might be in their late 20s, they might be in their late 30s, but they're brought in by parents saying, this is difficult for us to deal with. So it helps to have an adjunct in place. Now, that's a good question. At which stage can it be included? Now, you also understand that this person who's coming in, you have to assess how well can they be a part of a couple or a family therapy situation. Because if this person is highly dysregulated with a lot of problems that are very person-centered, right? They have very poor distress tolerance and they just cannot regulate emotions. Putting them in a couple therapy situation may not be suitable because of the reason that they will not be able to tolerate, they may not be able to take in the criticism that they're getting, and it might affect them more. So you can take a call, and I can't tell you exactly which number of sessions, but like when I gave you the pre-treatment and the stage 1, stage 2, I would say somewhere around stage 2, when you're working on symptom reduction, if you start as an adjunct, it might be helpful.
The second question by Jennifer again is, when is irreverent communication used by the therapist? I don't understand what is it irrelevant. Jennifer, can you please clarify what that means?
Ma'am, yes, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am.
Good
Firstly, thank you, ma'am, Adharani ma'am, for this lovely presentation. So, ma'am, in some books, again, this is not by Linehan herself, but there are two types of communication by the therapist. One is reciprocal communication, which leads to validating environment where you're providing warmth and support. And then there is also irreverent communication where they're talking about confrontation. So, so when is that used? As much as we do help them in bringing up the validating, I mean, you do validate them, there is some amount of confrontation needed. So when does that occur, ma'am?
Okay, that's also interesting. So the point is that in a client who is highly disturbed and it's the first contact in therapy, I wouldn't recommend using confrontations because they don't respond very well to that. There's a lot of research that's come up even recently which says that, you know, if you start off a person with borderline with psychodynamic or psychoanalytical kind of work, they take longer to respond to it. It's a very long drawn and they kind of deteriorate initially before they actually pick it up. So if you look at it, most of the therapies right now work with, so even if mentalization therapy is taken for that matter, which is quite recent, what they try to say is the client's ability to reflect is much slower. It's much lower. They don't have capacity when they're coming in initially, especially if it's their first confrontation with them. You're trying to get them to reflect on their behavior and, you know, kind of do that. That's not. That's why we feel like initially a DBT therapy approach to therapy, and where you validate them, where you make them comfortable, it increases their ability to reflect. They're highly emotionally aroused. So when you increase the arousal, you can't think. This happens for you and me too. Like when we are highly emotional, we don't think. Our thinking part of the brain, the frontal, prefrontal cortex, is just not functioning effectively. It's all your limbic system, which is just taking all the decisions that it wants, left, right, and center. So what I would say is, when you're able to regulate and understand that, okay, you know what, I'm feeling upset, but I can still think this and that. When you're at that stage, then possibly bringing in confrontation. And it can also be done rather than in this particular mode. You can also bring it about as a suggestion. Like when you start taking perspectives with them, as a part of your later on when you're problem solving and, you know, interpersonal, you talk about perspective.
Not able to hear Dharmi.
Maybe she got disconnected. Can we call her and we'll add her again? It's froze. Yeah. Yeah, she got logged out. She'll come.
Maybe some hope. Luckily, there was no problem earlier on during the participants. You can still keep posting your questions so that, you know, when she comes in, she's been very kind enough to stay back and, you know, answer the question. So
Nice, interesting questions we have. Related persons, how they can be supportive, and it was a comprehensive. How to form a team of mental health. I think this is a very valid question. We have a question on forgiveness, aspect of forgiveness. Yeah. Also, Anjali has asked, if family chooses not to come for therapy, then what?
she's connecting. She's coming in.
Yeah.
So, these are questions. I think all of them are really valid questions, and definitely need to be discussed in the book. Because even in private practice, there is a strong need for team to help in, and it also helps in also for the therapist or the psychologist or the clinical psychologist who's seeing the patient with the borderline personality disorder. It's always good. One is for us that we have a support system where we can objectively talk about and get feedback from others, and two, the patient herself or himself also sees how the team works together. Even though we may not be in the same center, there are some places where the psychiatrist, the social worker, the psychologist, clinical psychologist all work in the same center. Some places where they're all dispersed in different clinics, but still there is a connection. And then we also would tell the patient that it's always a teamwork, and we would at least have a teleconference or video calls to meet up and talk to people. So that's also one possibility in the Indian setup. Ideally, if you look at Linehan's model, we should all be in the same setup. But in India, we always have to
Plus,
look
it's
at
hospital challenge, right? So,
yeah.
in a clinic setting, I think we just network with the psychiatrist and the therapist. And so they go to different persons on different days.
Correct. Yeah. But it's a very relevant question, especially when every one of us can't be working in a place like Niman's or IMH, where everything is provided under the same roof. Good question. I will wait for her. She's joining back, she said. I would also request after we finish the question answer, any two of you to give feedback directly to Dr. Dharani. It will be very rewarding for her as well. Yeah, she's good. Can't hear you. The audio is just getting connected, I think. Yeah. No worries. We are all waiting. Yeah.
We are not on mute.
Connecting to audio.
Yeah, no.
Is it better now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. I'm so sorry about that.
So, Dr. Kitty, will you read out the question from Anjali?
Yes. So Anjali wanted to know, what if the family chooses not to come in for family therapy?
Well, that happens in most places, that family may not want to come in. So you don't have to, we can't do much about it, but you try to work your way around the whole situation.
I think she lost the connection again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I've just moved away from my laptop room. Okay.
So we were talking about family
members. So I said, I was saying that mostly in a lot of situations, it's not possible that the family will engage or they will turn up. But what we can instead do is work with the individual. And at some point, when you work on their relationships, the ways in which they are reacting, or the way in which they're interacting with their family members, once we alter that or change that a little bit, you can see that the family also notices that the person has made changes and that they are willing to and may come in for therapy. Or else you make other alternate arrangements where the conflicts are reduced. You structure the environment for the individual in such a way that the conflicts are reduced.
Thank you. Parvati also wanted to know about how significantly related others can be supportive to a person with borderline.
Okay, so there are a lot of different ways. One is you can always provide them, one of the things is you can psychoeducate them, help them to do the validation that you do. That seems to help the family members. The second thing that you can work with in terms of the family or the the other individuals who are important, significant others, is by telling them also that their self-care is important. Dealing with this person who's highly emotional, imagine you see them for 1 hour in a week, and these are people who probably see them 24/7 otherwise. So it is going to be exhausting, it's going to be difficult, and they also need to maintain boundaries, be consistent. So these can be sessions where you can do a few psychoeducation kind of session for the family, telling them how to be consistent with this person, how to deal with excessively problematic behavior, what should their response be? Do they need to also get scared and upset every time the person engages in a behavior? How do you handle those problem and crisis situations? Or something that you can train them. You can have separate sessions with the significant others. There's a lot of reading material available for family and friends of people with borderline, which you can also share with them. And in fact, there are a few support groups. I'm not sure whether they've opened up now because everything is online, but there are support groups for family and friends of people with borderline. There's a website called Family Connections, which gives you a lot of material to help the family work with individuals with borderline, or what they should do with their behavior.
Thank you. The next question is from Srinidhi. She wanted to know how would a mental health team work when you are in private practice?
So an example for that is what I'm doing currently. That in private practice, you can still have you can coordinate with a psychiatrist who is also seeing the person, because that helps. At least having 2 people on board will really help. You always get your own supervision group where you bring in your cases and you get people to supervise you. In private practice, this is possible, right? Something that we've set up right now, even for me, is I take these
You can tell them yourself, Dharani.
Right. So other than me being in supervision, I'm also thinking of running a supervision group where people who are seeing clients, and especially if you've just finished your basic qualifications, that you started seeing clients, it is always helpful to have supervision. So a colleague of mine and I are starting a small supervision group to meet once a week, have a small number of people who can always discuss their 1 or 2 clients, and we can follow it through a period or bring in new cases. So that will be something that we're planning to do. So all of this is possible in private practice also. And you have to remember that private practice is not to work in isolation. There's a lot of networking that happens, a lot of reliance on other health professionals. And it's helpful to do that. It's beneficial for your client also for you to be doing that.
Yes, and they also see us working in teams.
Yes.
Yeah, and that rapport really helps, I guess. Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is by Satyabhama. Is there anything DBT says about forgiveness in some situations that is necessary for clients' well-being?
So DBT does not really talk about forgiveness as a concept in itself, but what DBT talks about is acceptance of the situation and how do you make amends and how do you move on. That's different. But yeah, forgiveness is not a concept that DBT talks about per se. It's a very, and forgiveness is a very different, let's say that it's a very different technique itself when you're using it. It's easier said than done to forgive people, and genuinely from the heart. So that's a whole therapeutic module by itself, actually. It's not related to DBT much.
The next question is by Varsha. Can you please elaborate on skills that are inculcated in family members or romantic partners? I think you did this briefly, or maybe she wants more information on that.
So in addition, what I'm just going to concisely say is help them teach validation skills, help them take care of themselves, help them to, kind of deal with problematic situations that arise, crisis management, how to assert, them also assert, provide consistency to the client. So what you also notice in most of these families is the fact that they would say one thing, and when the person escalates the tension, they give in to it. They allow the person to do that, and they say, okay, you know what, she was creating a ruckus at home, so what will the neighbors think? So I'm going to do this. But that just reinforces the problem behavior. So what you tell them is, teach them a skill called the broken record. Like, you keep stating the same thing in a very monotonous tone. It's a very neutral tone. You don't say, how could you do that? You don't react to it, but rather say things, it would be great, it would be good if you can calm down a little bit. You need to say this, but we'll still be saying, no, I understand you're upset, but we can't do this right now. Maintaining that neutral tone and saying the same thing over and over again till it gets into the person is helpful. How do they take care? Sometimes if the person is becoming aggressive, how do you handle those situations? Have a crisis plan discussed with the family. These are things that you can discuss and equip the family members with.
A similar question is by Nandini, who says, dealing with parents of clients with BPD, how do you help them from not going into self-blame?
So that is an extremely tricky line, because you're not supposed to be, the parents are not to be blamed. And what you can focus upon is, with some of these parents, are that, we understand you did the best you could. You've been doing what is the best that you talked about it. Understand that your child had special requirements, which was unlike what happened. Put it into perspective for them that they were not bad parents, but rather the circumstances were such that they didn't, and there was not a proper fit. Explain that your child's requirements were not something of a normal child. So it was possible that you missed out on it, and you did the best you can. And those are the things that you can talk to them. But however, right now, this is a problem that they have developed because of certain kinds of the way they perceived and interpreted the world. Now, how do you help them to become better? And what are some of the things that you were doing which were unhelpful before, which you can correct right now? And that's all it is. And you just have to keep emphasizing that nobody is perfect. Even as a therapist, you will make errors. You will make mistakes. There'll be ruptures in your alliance with your BPD clients. And you will realize the rupture happening much later. So you would, but the point is, there's always a repair after the rupture. And that becomes essential with your borderline clients. The same thing with the family. If you've made a mistake, it's okay to make a mistake, but address it, talk about it, and solve it. Don't leave it unresolved. Do not push things under the carpet. Is something that you will kind of speak to them about.
Healing the wound.
Healing the wound.
Yeah. Varsha, just one more question. What symptoms are sensory toys recommended for?
I was about to ask that. Yeah.
What was that? I'm sorry. Can you repeat that question?
Yeah. Varsha wanted to know for what symptoms are sensory toys recommended.
So sensory toys are not necessarily recommended in because you're dealing with adult BPD, right? So what I meant in terms of a stuffed toy was just that was something comforting for her. You use your 5 senses to self-soothe. So whatever they found comforting to touch, for some people, it could be, things like, usually softness is very soothing. So touch something that is soft and keep rubbing on that can actually calm them down. It's something protective, feeling. So in that context is when I brought in the stuffed toys, and I don't necessarily mean that you have sensory toys being used with adults with BPD. It's not very necessary. It's not very, not something that I commonly come across people using. And this you check with the person, like what calms you down. So you tell them to try different smells, try different objects which are tactile, and then you ask them to pick what suits them. Don't give them, say, do this will work. It never works that way. It is the person who has to decide what works for them. You can give them options.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask you if pets would help. It's not there in the DBT, but
Yeah,
yeah.
it's not there in DBT, but surprisingly, a lot of clients have felt better, and this is more of them with cats rather than dogs.
Yeah.
I see a very, I don't know, I mean, this is not maybe research or anything, but what I've noticed is a lot of my borderline clients have had cats, and they find those pets very reassuring. They find it easy to communicate. They like the fact that there's an animal which animals kind of love you unconditionally. So it's a very therapeutic to have pets around. But also remember that when you're suggesting them to have pets, it depends upon the state in which they are in. Because I had a client who first came to me for therapy who told me that the reason she came for therapy is because she recently adopted a stray dog. I mean, not a stray dog, adopted a puppy, and she was hitting the puppy when she got upset. She was beating the puppy up and she was hurting the puppy, and that scared her, which is why she came in. So in that case, I asked her to keep away from the puppy. She felt that the needs of the pet was overwhelming given her distress. And that is one of the reasons why I would say that that you need to kind of be careful about suggesting having pets. But yes, in most cases, having a pet calms them. It's very soothing and it's very helpful.
It again is case by case.
Case by case, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, that was the last question in the chat box. If anybody wants to ask, you can please unmute and ask your question directly.
Yeah, if anyone wants to share feedback or question, yes, please go ahead.
For students' sake, can you also add a few lines about the opportunities in NIMHANS to get into junior research fellow or PhD? So there are quite a few students.
Okay. So as far as I was, the NIMHANS for PhD or for the MPhil, are we talking about both?
Both, yeah.
Okay. So for the MPhil, usually there is an entrance exam that happens sometime around Feb-March. This year it's not happened because of the pandemic, but usually around Feb-March there is an entrance exam that you have to write, and then they select around 30 students. For MPhil, there's only one way, that is the PhD. I mean, that's the entrance exam. If you already have a JRF, then there is a category, which means that even after the cutoff, you would have a slight reservation for getting in. You'll have a higher chance that they would take you in if you have a JRF with you. In terms of PhD, you have different ways of getting in. One, you have an entrance exam that again happens in Feb-March, where the intake, I think they take in only 3 or 4 students actually with the institute fellowship. But there's also other things. But if you have a JRF, or whether it is UGC or ICMR, you can apply through that, and that there is an intake twice in a year. There is an intake that happens during the Feb-March for the June academic year, and there is another intake that happens somewhere around November for a December intake. So that happens twice. I had gotten through the ICMR. I'd qualified for ICMR JRF, and my intake happened in December. So for this, you do not require to write an exam. Following an exam for PhD, even if you score it, or even with the JRF, you will have an interview. And once you get into you have to qualify for the interview. There's a panel of professors who will ask you questions about statistics. They'll ask you about your research idea, field of research. How do you talk about it? And then you will have a selection post that you'll be announced.
Thank you. So students, anybody would like to give feedback? Come on, students. Jennifer, Nandini, Mukesh.
Ma'am, this is Jen.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, firstly, I think it was a very comprehensive, at the same time, very detailed presentation that we saw. And the thing with DBT is that everybody thinks it's only emotion regulation and it stops right there. Distress tolerance, which is also an important aspect, is also incorporated. And I think today was the first time I actually understood acceptance and change, the concept of it, because as you, like you said, you may read it in a book, but you will not really be able to carry forward with these skills unless and until you practice it with supervision. So I think that was very nicely put out, and I think we do have a very good orientation to the topic, ma'am. So thank you once again, ma'am. And to Element Hedge, to Kirti ma'am, as well as Sandhya ma'am, thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you for the feedback.
Thank you, Jennifer. Anybody else from our interns? Quickly, there are a lot of messages in the chat box. Or
Yeah, you can go through the chat box, I think.
yeah,
Yes.
a lot of people saying thank you. I think Dr. Reena is from Manipal.
Yes, I have spoken to Dr. Reena via chats and things. I just now got a
Okay.
place to connect to
Okay,
the.
yeah. Reena, would you like to show us your face?
She spoke earlier, then she said
Okay.
she'll be on mute because she's attending between
Between cases, yeah.
between cases. So she said whenever possible she will. So initially they got introduced.
Okay. I think, may I request Sandhya, Dr. Sandhya, to do the vote of thanks?
Yeah, I think my vote of thanks, if I start reading the chat box itself, it will go on for half an hour. I think everybody is appreciated so much about how excellent it is, how informative it is, how each stage was, clarified for them, and they really enjoyed. They found it engaging, insightful, great presentation. I mean, it just goes on and on here. So I think you can get the feedback speaks for itself how wonderful it was, the way you took us step by step through every stage and challenges and what works, what won't work. So it was very beautifully presented, and especially in 2 hours giving it in as crisp as with the initial introduction to BPD as well. I think you have made it a very professional presentation, very crisp at the same time, not missing out anything. So
Thank you.
it was great, and I think we will keep bothering you and inviting you again and again. Also, Dharani. So thank you so much for coming over and spending this past 2 hours with us and giving us the valuable inputs. Thank you, participants, students. I think this time we had a lot of people from IAPS and other academic institutions and professionals. So thank you all so much for coming for this talk as well. Please come. You see how interesting these talks are, and we'll keep posted in the Insta and Facebook and the other social media. We post in most of the WhatsApp group that we're part of, we will be posting. So please watch out and do participate. Thank you so much, participants. Thank you, Kirti, for arranging this program, fixing this day. And of course, my dear office staff, Veena, Parvati, Kezia, Ume Kulsum, I think they're all here managing and taking care of the participants. And so thank you so much, dear team. So of course, Element H won't be anything without all of you here. So thanks everyone for the presence, and thanks Dharani also for your talk.
Thank you so much. It is
Thank
really
you so much, Dharani.
It was a really nice experience, and thank you so much for inviting me, giving me this opportunity to talk about a topic that's very close to my heart.
When we thought of DBT, I could only think of you. So that's why we thought that we should catch you before you get more busier than what you are now. So really very informative. And
Thank
I think
you.
you've covered all the points which is required.
I'm
Super.
glad.
Yeah.